So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand.
Atheist and agnostic as well as many times.
It's a new day, and we have another co-host again. It's a new day. And our doggy co-host is back for Jingles and Barks.
Just shaking like a leaf.
That's why I say jingles.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to another episode
of the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
I'm Katie.
I'm Preston.
And this is an episode of Preston Research, so I'm just gonna let him talk. What are we talking about today?
We want to talk about the breadth of what is the religions of the world. That's a super broad topic of when I started religious studies at university. There was the course that had formerly been one that they decided to expand and split into two.
Mm.
There was Intro to Western Religion, Intro into Eastern Religions.
Mm.
They all of the world religions come from Asia. When we like to think
true.
East and West, usually we talk about, oh yeah, China's in the East and we're America in the West. No. Eastern and Western religions, they're all out of the world religions, Asian religions.
Come from the continent of Asia.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Western religions are from Western Asia, specifically the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when we talk about Western religions, when we talk about world religions, we're just talking about the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I like to say them in that order, not out of a preference for one or the other, but chronological order. And I'm sure other people have reasons for preferring a different order. That's the way I do it.
That's how I do it too.
And then in the East, further east in Asia, you've got Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Shinto, and they're wildly different from that Western set of Abrahamic religions.
Mm-hmm.
But calling them Eastern and Western just feels weird usually when we say Western, we're talking like Greece and further west.
And I imagine because it's not all-encompassing, well, there's also the problem of just globalism, and you can be anything anywhere in the world for the most part.
Absolutely. And
we'll do an episode on these one day. I say that every episode. But Western religion doesn't talk about indigenous religions. And then there's indigenous religions. There's indigenous religions of Australia, which isn't encompassed by Eastern religion.
Right.
And then all these sort of weird offshoots, I guess. But you have paganism, which I don't think fits in either bubble.
Not really. Not technically. Eastern and Western religions, those labels are only useful. And I say useful in finger quotes because, that only applies to the world religions, those huge religions that
the big boys
are all over the place, that are unified more or less around the world. Like Christianity, not exactly unified, but kind of all around the world. Whereas if you want to compare them to animism or primal religions that are literally on every continent except Antarctica, there's enough of them scattered around the world that you could call them a world religion, but they never make it into that discussion.
So what I'm hearing is that
even the label is a problem.
The label's a problem. But we'll probably be doing an episode on some smaller religions.
Yeah, for sure.
But we wanted to do this episode as a basis. We are going to, in the following episodes after Christmas and the New Year, we're going to dedicate a full episode to each of these world religions. And we want to do that so that we have a groundwork to build off of. So when we want to talk about bigger concepts in a specific religion, that we're all on the same page. But let's break down the differences between, I guess, the Abrahamic religions and everything else. Because there, I didn't say Eastern and Western.
Perfect. All right. So usually one of the big things is their theological models. Shintoism has these beliefs in various kami, which can be, I think I've mentioned this before, a kami is anywhere in that range between a spirit who affects something to a god who affects either one specific thing or many things. A great Eastern god is Zhimashen, which I think is a fun name.
One more time.
Zhimashen.
Zhimashen.
He's the Chinese god of sesame,
Ooh.
right?
Ooh.
I'm actually only fairly certain it's a he, to be honest.
They.
Zhimashen, is the god of sesame. So he or she, they. This is hard.
You can do it, I believe in you. They.
Zhimashen deals with just the growth of sesame as a plant from seed to whatever that process is. To be completely honest, I am wildly undereducated on the growth cycle of sesame.
Well, good thing that's not what our podcast is about.
We don't deal with any sort of vegetation, really, apart from how they occasionally, in this particular situation, is a good example, deal with gods. And he's one example of the very niche stewardships that gods have in the East. That there's specific things that you have concerns about in your life. If you're worried about the rain, if you're worried about a river not drying up, if you're worried about your crops growing, then you deal with the god that deals with that specific crop, that specific river, or the rain more broadly. Usually it's slightly more regional when it's the rain. Zhimashen is just a cool example because it sounds like a cool name. And when I was looking for, the whole A to Z of gods, I decided, well, let's look at the end of the god alphabet, and Zhimashen was near the end, and he was the god of sesame, and I thought it'd be cool to talk about a little bit, despite my wildly underwhelming knowledge of sesames.
If you're a sesame producer, send us an email at holywatermelonpod@gmail.com.
Yeah. Send us your hate mail and tell us how aggravated you are at my underwhelming knowledge. And I think it's a cool example of the breadth of the theological model in the East, in the non-Abrahamic religions. Whereas in specifically Islam and modern Judaism, they are very, very stiffly monotheistic. Mm-hmm. There is one God, that's it. He deals with everything except for the things that he just straight up doesn't deal with. If you're going to pray to win the lottery, the God of Islam and Judaism isn't going to help you out. You're either going to win or you're not. It's a game of chance. It's a high-risk game of chance. God doesn't play those kinds of games in those theological models. Christianity is far more complicated. But when Jesus taught, he tried to help people to recognize a slightly older Israelite theology. Though he doesn't teach about the Asherah, the mother goddess addressed in the Old Testament, it's easy enough to see the influence there in his teachings of an older form of Judaism, of the Israelite faith. And so Asherah, there's the A from the A to Z.
Oh, you said the name of the podcast! Say the full name of the podcast.
You mean the episode?
Yeah. From
Asherah to Zhimashen.
When they say the name of the movie in the movie.
Right.
So I just wanted to give everyone that little.
Here it is.
Here it is.
All right. So in theological models, you've got a nice broad spectrum of how many gods there are and how involved they are. Might even be more of like
He's making a box with his hands.
Yeah. The word that's coming to mind is Punnett square, and that is not what I'm trying to say. Like a Cartesian plane, where you've got a thing that measures this way and a thing that measures this way, X and Y axis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so you've got monotheism on one end, polytheism with thousands of gods on the other end, as is familiar in Hinduism, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then on a perpendicular plane or axis,
up and down.
And the way I'm moving my hands,
He's
the former was left and right, and the latter is up and down.
How radio side.
You've got how involved these gods are.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Hinduism, for example, most of the gods are very specialized. And so they would be in the not terribly involved in all of the things, but very involved in a specific thing. And then in Islam and Judaism, and mostly Christianity as well, you've got one God who's involved in most of the things, but a handful of things he's not involved in. Until, of course, you want to get into Catholicism, which, as we talked about before, the saints of Catholicism straight up are worshipped as gods.
Yeah.
You pray to them. Sometimes, though not usually, there's some sort of offering. And you hope that they will help you with a specific problem. That's not different from what we observe in the East with the various kami.
Yeah.
And that's also not universal in Christianity. That's a very specifically Catholic feature.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, though we talk about it being one of the monotheistic faiths, it's not true monotheism. It's what we call an ideal monotheism.
Okay.
Which, to illustrate that most effectively, I want to compare it to the world in which it came to be. In Hellenism, you have, like out east, many gods, each dealing with specific things. You've got Aphrodite, you've got Dionysus, you've got Zeus. You can't please all of the gods. You usually pick one as your patron god, and you offer sacrifices to that god. The sacrifices you offer for Aphrodite are wildly different than the sacrifices you offer to honor Hades or any of the other gods. Aphrodite was all about sex. Dionysus was all about partying.
I like both of those.
Right? And they're not mutually exclusive, but they are different. And so in ancient Israel, when they did in fact deal with more than one god, there was El or El Shaddai or Jehovah, or however you want to pronounce the name, Yahweh. There was Baal, there was Asherah. There was occasionally specific things that people would do to worship a specific god. But the way that it was taught from the prophets was that there is one way to worship God. And the teaching of one God was one of two things. It was always never put anybody before Yahweh, specifically stated an awful lot in the Old Testament, as this is the primary God of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
He is our Savior. He is the one who delivers our nation from peril. He is the nation who delivers us from death. This is the God who delivers us from all things that plague us as a nation. And all of the other gods are just kind of incidental. Asherah is a mother goddess, that there's nothing that she offers to the nation other than a maternal figure, which is helpful in having a non-entirely masculine pantheon, but she's important. And her worship is connected to the worship of Yahweh, which I think is fascinating. That the statement, there is one God in Israel, isn't a mathematical statement, it's a moral statement.
Mm-hmm.
That there's one way to worship here, and we honor God by doing that one kind of worship and offering sacrifices to one God. In that theological family tree, the whole of God being a title rather than a name is honored, and that family of gods is honored. And Christianity actually carries that pretty effectively. Trinitarian Christians, which are one of many groups of Christians, or groups of groups, Trinitarian Christians have this idea that Jesus is God, and the Father is God, and the Holy Ghost is God. But that doesn't mean they're all the same person. There's a diagram that you can find if you Google the Trinity that has all of them saying Jesus is, the Father is, the Holy Ghost is God. But there's also lines in between each of them pointing out that Jesus is not the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost is not the Father. The Father is not Jesus. Which is really confusing if you want to say that God is one person's title. It's like Mr. President. Bill Clinton is still Mr. President. So is Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the same person. But they have the same title. They also don't have the same power. That the Bible tells us that Jesus came forth from the Father and sends us the Holy Ghost. That they are different, but also unified. So there's what we call an ideal monotheism, which is not the same thing as true monotheism, which is not a universal model for Christians. You've also got people like the Christadelphians and Jehovah's Witnesses who do not revere Jesus as a god, but just as the Son of God. He was mortal, he died, he happened to rise again, and that's pretty sweet. But they don't revere him as the God.
Trinity,
yeah, they straight out reject the Christian Protestant Trinity. And then Mormons have this model that really much more has an affinity with the old ancient Israelite model of there's a Father, he is a God. There's Jesus, the Son, who is a God who's not the same person. So an awful lot in common with the Catholic Protestant model, but it is more interested in leaning towards that old Israelite model of there's also a Heavenly Mother who is not just an incidental figure, but is deeply important to the whole program. And there's gods before the Father God, which is actually a position not held commonly among Christians, but Mormons teach it. Joseph Smith actually had recorded in a couple of instances and had his scribes also record a name for the first God before the Father of Jesus Christ. And that name is Alish, which sounds like a reasonably cool made-up name. Alish sounds to me, with my basic Hebrew education, like a name that straight up means God-man.
God-man. That sounds like a superhero.
Right? A superhero with an intense hero complex. Even a God complex.
All the complex. With a name like God-man, you have all the complexes.
Right? There's a serious
God-man Borg. Man-Borg's a great movie if anyone needs a bad movie to watch this weekend.
Man-Borg was pretty great. Terrible, but...
Terrible.
But it's available. All right. Yeah, so the name Alish is slightly suspect, but also all of the names that we have of the Hebrew gods are names that have a meaning rather than just being a given name like Katie or Preston, which, I mean, if you look into the etymology of the names, all names have some sort of meaning, but we don't throw them around as casually 4000 BC as we do today.
And they obviously don't hold like the same connotation or that they would back then.
Right.
Just thinking what my name means. I'm like,
What does your name
mean? It means purity.
Okay.
Which I mean, I guess is great for a chunk of your life.
Sure. Preston is from I think Middle English, I think, of just priest town.
Oh.
Yeah. Because it's a town in England, and then people name their kids after places often, and I'm fairly certain that's how the name Preston came into use as a name for people. Yeah, it's not terribly exciting at all.
No, that's actually, I mean...
Actually, a great example of that is you have women named Alexandra and women named Alexandria. One of those is a city name named after a man named Alexander. The other is the feminine form of Alexander. And I will let you look up your own name rather than tell you you've been named wrong.
You find out something horrible about your name, so you shoot us an email at holywatermelonpod.net.
Send me your hate mail.
I don't know why you're vying for hate mail.
A little piece of me really wants to read hate mail.
I just want people to email us, period.
I need feedback, and I feel like probably half will be hate mail.
I mean, we are talking about dun 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 religion.
Right? And religion is often very contentious.
Let's say something contentious now.
All right.
All-ish is where we left off, made up names.
Yeah. There's all of the gods of the Old Testament have names that have a meaning that sound a little bit made up when you look at their context. And there's no reason to believe that if all of the gods are real, that those would be their real names. They're titles more than anything else, I think. So that's not an issue for me, really. But it's interesting to compare the models, the theological models from one religion to the next. You've got soft polytheism, or even what we call henotheism in old Israelite religion and in Mormonism. Henotheism. It's not even that hard of a word to say, but I'll screw it up like half the time.
That's fine.
Henotheism is the worship of one God, with the acknowledgement that there are other gods who are worthy of worship, which is actually observable in the Old Testament when you see how armies come to war with the armies of other nations, and they'll talk about each other's gods like they're real people. And we'll see what Baal will do for you, but Yahweh will protect us.
Oh,
that kind of thing.
I have questions about this, actually. I think this is very interesting. So, henotheism is opposing religions, not like in Hinduism where you worship. I literally am blanking on all Hindu gods right now.
You got Shiva,
Thank
Krishna.
Thank you. I've tried all episodes. I've been like, what is a Hindu god name? I know this.
Vishnu.
It's not worshiping Shiva while knowing Vishnu exists. It's actually two opposing religions. Or it could be either.
It can be either. In Hinduism, as far as was taught to me in the university, is you've got Brahma, who is like the chief of all the things, but super uninvolved. Remember,
like most bosses,
right?
Oh.
Remember when we talked about our first episode, how there was this belief in a sky god that nobody really did anything with, but worshipped his undergods? From what I can observe of academically recorded Hinduism in the books that I've been told to read for my university courses, it looks like Brahma is that figure. And then there's three main gods immediately beneath him who appear to delegate work to thousands of other gods and also appear as avatars from time to time. It's actually a super complicated theological model that I think is really interesting, but could certainly know a lot more about to address properly in this podcast.
Wow.
We'll have an episode for that, which I will be properly prepared for. That I believe at some point in history, there was definitely conflicts between a group who worshipped one of those three gods and another group who worshipped one of the other of the three gods. And there was, and then a third doing the same thing. And they probably came up with some sort of peace. There's a lot of conjecture that that's how the Israelite nation came to be, there with 12 tribes, each not being unified, but later joined together and created this father figure, Jacob, to be Israel, the unifying power of the father of these 12 tribes. I think that there was something very similar in India, but I don't think there's strong evidence, just like there isn't strong evidence for that model in Israel.
It's really old.
It's super ancient history. A lot of it's barely recorded, and we rely on artifacts, finding little things. Like Asherah, we find little dolls all over Israel that we know are Asherah figurines because people worshipped the mother goddess in public or private an awful lot. And it's really fascinating. You've got ancient Greece. You have Zeus, who defeats Kronos. You've got Jupiter, who defeats Saturn. And those sound an awful lot like stories of one group, nation, tribe, whatever, defeating another and imposing their god, saying, our god has defeated your god. The stories will figure out how it's cosmically justified, but you worship Jupiter now. He is the god of this people.
Interesting.
It is super fascinating.
So, henotheism, worshiping one God while acknowledging the existence and validity of another. I'm going to make the contentious point.
Go for it.
Can/should we aim towards henotheism in our current society? Obviously, I'm all for secularism, but as people move, obviously there's like a journey of people moving away from religion. The world's getting more and more atheistic. But in the meantime, I feel like henotheism is a not bad option for people getting along. Is that there? I said it. That's the controversial statement of the day. Can you not? I'm talking to you, my congregants now. Accept the validity of another God while still believing in your own.
So there's one major problem with that. That most people who believe in a God in North America are Christians. And most Christians believe in an absolutist theology that, taught a little bit more firmly in the New Testament than in the Old, that there is only one God and only one in the model of an ideal theology, ideal monotheism versus a true monotheism, only one kind of God, only one way to worship God. And if you worship anybody other than Jesus, for example, coming from the Christian perspective, you're doing it wrong and you need to be corrected, which is a problem. Absolutism in religion is the grounds for conflict, just like absolutism in nationalism is a huge problem and validates conflict with other nations. The exact same thing is true in religion, and why nationalism is usually guilty of holding all of the landmarks of a religion. As much as I would love to say that, yeah, that's the easy way for peace, I don't think you're going to have people subscribe to it.
Oh. But still subscribe to our podcast. Even if you don't subscribe to henotheism.
What's really great, actually, is for 2,000 years, Christianity has been present in India. Not constantly, but we have from about 2,000 years ago. St. Thomas the Apostle went to India, taught the people, and pretty much since that time, people are like, yeah, we accept Jesus as an avatar of Vishnu or of Shiva, or whatever aspect is highlighted in Jesus, they'll see that as a manifestation of a God that they already worship. The reason Jesus died, of course, is because he was preaching that he was a son of God in a monotheistic state. Post-exile Israel and Judea was very strictly monotheistic, like Islam and Judaism are today. And so what Jesus taught was dangerous for his life expectancy, and he died. But if Jesus were to show up in India, for example, there's no reason for him to die. They have a long history of people showing up.
We'll just fit you in the back of the family photo.
Right?
Yeah.
India has so many gods that adding one more is not a problem for literally anybody. So when the missionaries show up saying, we have a god, they're like, okay, let's add him to the list.
Cool.
Not that all Hindus worship Jesus.
And I know Christianity exists as its own entity in India as well.
Absolutely.
It's taken hold as Christianity, not as a...
An awful lot of people have adopted that faith and rejected their former gods that they worshiped, but not universally, because it's easy enough to say, yeah, Jesus is one of the enlightened teachers. There's plenty of Buddhists who like Jesus. There's a book. It's like the Bible, but it's like 90% shorter. The Jefferson Bible, I think, is a book that's easy to read because it's the Gospels, just the 4 Gospels from the New Testament, but cut up to remove any supernatural element, including any miracles. So it's just the teachings of Jesus and a handful of events in his life, which make for a really short read, but a decent manual for teaching how to live with people and how to be a good neighbor, how not to be a complete
I was going to say swear, Preston. Say it, swear on the microphone.
It didn't feel natural in the sentence, but I just also couldn't find the word I was looking for.
Wow.
Religion is tricky, which we're going to say and realize and point out often throughout the course of this show.
Episode. Is it fair to say that Eastern religions are mostly polytheistic and Westerns are mostly monotheistic? Is that a good way to split them up for our listeners?
I think that's the basis of the title split mostly is generally people accept Christianity to be within that monotheistic bubble, but it's never good to use it as an example of monotheism. It's far better to use modern Judaism or Islam because they are true monotheists. There's one God, everything else is inferior. Mm-hmm. Christianity just is super complicated in that respect and diverse from one group to another. And yeah, that seems to be the split between East and West of the world religions when you want to ignore the primal religions and animism and things like that, the pagan religions. That's another word that I don't really like. Pagan is only meant to be used in a pejorative, derogative kind of way. Mm. Until recently, more people have started using it as a self-identifier, more out of the understanding that this is the word that we use to describe them now, kind of thing. It's like, actually, even the name Christian was used by other people against the followers of Jesus. And then they're just like, yeah, okay, that's what we'll call ourselves now to identify us as different from the other Jews.
Oh, good. I couldn't think of a band name.
Right? That's exactly the way it went. We need a label to identify our group. Let's use the one that everyone else is using, and that'll keep it simple. So paganism is an example of that. It's usually a polytheistic model that is localized to a specific group or nation. The Slavs had one kind of set of gods. The Greeks had another. The Celts had their own interesting set of gods. And also usually had some really cool non-god figures in their mythology that were a lot of fun too.
So I've heard the stat, and tell me if you've heard different, Preston, that collectively the human race believes in about 3,000 different gods. 3,000 is the number I've heard.
That sounds reasonable. I think that when I was in my intro to Eastern religions, they said there was about 1,000 different Hindu gods. And that's a huge number, but there's also more than 1 billion people in India right now, I think. I feel pretty confident that's still true. And though there's not going to be one god for every million of them, that's not actually a wild number either.
Thinking, yeah.
And with all of the primal religions of localized communities all over Australia, Africa, South America, and North America. And realistically, there was probably still a few old primal religions surviving in Europe somewhere. Like all over the world, there's got to be thousands more.
Mm-hmm. So what we're saying is that this podcast is going to go on for a long time.
We got a lot to cover.
We'll have to do all the indigenous religions, and then we'll have to do all these like ancient Celts and Norse and...
Which are super cool.
They are super cool. And those, to be clear, do not fall into this Western Eastern world religions. There's, like I said, there's about 7 that do.
In the East, we also have, I mentioned briefly when I was just spouting out a list, Taoists who don't generally believe in any gods at all. You've got lots of Buddhists who believe that Buddha straight up is a god. But I think an overwhelming majority will say that worrying about theology at all is a waste of your time and energy.
I could be very wrong because it's been a long time since I've been in religious studies, and I only did 1 year, one class 1 year, a long time ago. I feel like Eastern religions, the word I want to use is more spiritual, and I know these definitions, Preston, are going to kill me. But I feel like Buddhism and what I know of Taoism focus a lot on like meditation.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure most of them have reincarnation or like coming back as you want to come back as something better instead of it being
worse.
finite.
Mhm.
Whereas, there's like your life on earth in Abrahamic religions and then you die and hopefully go to heaven or hell.
Right.
Whereas they talk about like this cycle of reincarnation. I don't know if spiritual is the right word, but in some ways it feels more maybe esoteric is the word I'm looking for. Am I making any sense?
There's more mystery in the Eastern
Mysticism,
religions.
yeah, maybe that's even.
There's only a little bit of what is typically called mysticism in the Western religions. There's Kabbalah for Judaism. There's Rosicrucians within Christianity, which tend to be pretty esoteric, mystical. Mormons are kind of mystical, but compared with the other mainstream Christianity, but not really so much. There's, why am I blanking on the group that is kind of the mystics of Islam? I want to say Sufi, and I'm going to have to check and make sure that that's right. Sufi Muslims are the more mystical ones.
I read a book on Islam earlier this year, and I want to agree with you, but also can't confirm.
I feel like this is a thing we need to Google real quick, make sure I'm not saying something straight up wrong.
Sufism, also known as tasawwuf, variously defined as Islamic mysticism.
All right.
The inward dimension of Islam, or the phenomenon of mysticism within Islam, is mysticism in Islam. This is the
I'm glad I was right.
Wikipedia definition, in which I said is Islam mysticism 6 times.
Nice.
So we know you're right, for sure.
Good. Because I hate to be spreading misinformation. All right. So we've got Sufi Islam, which is also mystical. And those are usually not very popular parts of Western religions. But in Eastern religions, as was highlighted back in the counterculture of 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, or ish, long before I was around.
The 1960s,
60s, 70s. In the 60s and 70s, there was this huge push to have all these people who were tired of their stuffy Christian parents pressuring them to do things they didn't like. They would go out and learn more about the mystical religions of the East. And it was a really weird time for religion. That's when witchcraft became wildly popular out of nowhere, it seemed, in America. And you had a lot of rebirth of Scandinavian and Celtic and Egyptian faiths as well.
To jump in, and I hope I don't kill your train of thought, but in North America, I feel like it's very cyclical. So the 50s, that was very
hardline
Christian. Husband, wife, 2.5 kids, dog, American dream. And then we had the 60s. And then there is I forget what it's called, but there's like this like born again Christian, because all these hippies had done too many drugs and burnt out. So they go back into Christianity. And I don't really know what the cycles look like now, but if you are after that to present, but right now, looking at the States in particular, they're very hardline Christians. So I imagine in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see it back to.
I think we've already seen a start of a new counterculture.
Okay.
I'm curious to see how it plays out. I could be wrong that it might not actually happen for another couple of decades. I think I see it starting now, and we'll see it play out, and maybe we'll give you a play-by-play over the course of our podcast history. We'll see. It's interesting to see how, from time to time, we get really into what people are doing with their faith that's very different from our own across the world, and seeing how we can implement some or all of that into our life, sometimes meaning that we abandon what we had before, sometimes doing a melding of the two, which leads to some pretty interesting behaviors and theological development.
Well, maybe you want to explain a little bit more about or define what mysticism is for some of our listeners, and maybe Katie, what characterizes mysticism or a mystical experience? What separates these groups that you're talking about from the rest of, so the Rosicrucians, the Sufis, and the Kabbalah?
Yeah, Kabbalah.
Um,
Jews is pretty
From
mystic.
the rest of their groups, religions.
Usually it's dealing with how to live a spiritual life and investigating what that means. Sometimes you'll have aspects of magic show up in that. Usually the deal with it is that you're not focusing on the law that has been presented. For example, in Judaism, the Torah that Moses delivered is hugely important. And in the Kabbalah, your focus is not so much on these are the things I have to do to make it into heaven. You're focused on what is the spiritual life, what is going on inside who I am that makes me who I am, and how can I adjust that to be better aligned with God without so much focusing on these are the laws. The Kabbalah deals with a lot of that internal stuff, and that's, as far as I can tell, pretty broadly universal in the East. It's about not regulating yourself with all this legislation, but about examining yourself and what energy makes you who you are and how that connects to the universe, which can often look magical.
Yep.
And as far as I can tell, that's kind of like the short summary of what is mysticism in religion. There's definitely plenty more to it.
I'm having a lot of thoughts is my problem right now.
Okay.
I mean, esoteric is the word I use, and that is what you've described.
Yeah.
Now, I've never been to a Eastern religion service.
Me neither.
Which maybe we should.
I do know where a couple of Sikh and Buddhist temples are in the city.
Brian's done a Buddhist thing once before
Okay.
Before we met. I feel like this could be totally wrong and you might not even know the answer and we're going to get a hate email. I feel like the Eastern religions put a lot of focus on yourself as, I'm trying to figure out, as part of the whole to better the world. Whereas I feel like Western religions, and maybe this is just Western culture, but it's like you put focus on other people, but for like the benefit of yourself.
It looks that way an awful lot of the time.
I think Western, just society, culture, not even religions, as very like individualistic, a little bit dog eat dog. I want to do what's best for me, not what's best for the group. And Eastern, again, societal, not just religions, as they do what's best for the community. But the way the religions go about it, I hope I'm making sense. You're giving me the look like I'm not making any sense. Is that the Eastern religions, you focus on your internal self. And I feel like Western religions, people, like, they even worship in bigger groups and they, like, self-police. So you worry about the group in elevating the individual. Whereas in Eastern, you worry about the individual to elevate the group. Please, like, give me something.
I feel like, in my observations, they're both in the major Eastern and Western religions, there's pressure to be your best self and to use your example to encourage others to be their best self. That's what Jesus taught too. But what we observe here in Canada and the United States is a Christianity that, or at least the prevalent Christianity that's super visible, is a bunch of people who will use the laws that they're supposed to use to govern themselves to abuse their neighbors who don't see value in those rules anyway. For example, the extremely homophobic Westboro Baptist Church.
Megan Phelps, if you're listening, I'd love to interview you.
They don't self-police in any way that is different from the rest of Christianity, but they put an awful lot more pressure on people outside of their community to conform to their standards, which is something that I have never observed from the Eastern religion people.
No, and again, this is from 10 years ago, religious studies, but Western religions are notoriously evangelical and always looking to convert people,
Mhm.
with the exception of Judaism, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll probably talk about quite a bit when we do our episode on Judaism, whereas I've never been approached by an Eastern religion.
No, not at all. In fact, if you were to go to a Sikh temple and say, "Hey, I'm hungry and I need shelter," they will offer you food and shelter. And if you ask them,
What do you do?
what do I need to know about God? They're not usually gonna jump on that opportunity to teach you about their faith. They're usually just going to try and help you, and if you insist on learning, then you can learn. But they're not evangelical at all.
No. Whereas if I asked the same question at a Mormon church,
You would have so many people who are super excited at the opportunity to share with you.
but you would still be fed.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
If you show up at a church and say, "Hey, I need food," I'm not aware of any that would turn you away, unless, of course, you went to, say, the Westboro Baptist Church and say, "Hey, could you feed me and my gay husband?" Then they'd be like, "We need you to leave."
I think if you, Preston, a man, show up with your husband, you don't actually need to say that it's your gay husband because you'd be too many.
Yeah, but if I were to say, "Feed me and my gay husband,"
they'd go running.
that would be definitely me clarifying for them a reason that they would use to not feed me.
Fair. Even as an atheist, that's like my travel hack. Especially, well, because we have so many Mormon friends, if I'm ever in trouble, find a church. Because especially if you're, my last big trip was backpacking Guatemala, especially if you're in a town or city that doesn't have your embassy, and if you're to lose your passport and all your money,
Churches are usually going to help you out.
How do you get, in the case of Guatemala, how do you get back to Guatemala City to go to the Canadian embassy if everything's gone? So there you go. There's my travel hack. This is not a travel podcast.
But generally, as far as I've been able to observe, every religion that has amassed more than 1,000, no, that's not fair. Some cults have bigger groups than that.
Oh, excuse me.
And, you know, I'm not going to disqualify Scientology from my upcoming general statement.
Okay.
I suspect, and have not observed contrary, that if you show up at any church that has a large following, especially one that is multinational, and say, "I need food," you're going to get fed. The Scientology that
They'd
you
probably charge you.
I don't think they would charge you. I don't think they'd ask money for the meal, but there would be an awful lot of pressure to stick around, start living in their bunks, and start adopting some new philosophies.
Yeah.
And to be honest, a lot of churches would probably at least ask you about your faith.
Well, yeah, this is how we got down this rabbit hole. Western churches are far more likely to evangelize you.
Yeah.
Again, Western religions,
Yes.
not physical locations.
Yeah.
If you show up to a Mormon church in China, they will bring it up. If you show up into a Shinto temple,
Try finding one in China.
Is that not a thing?
It's
I just picked one.
Yeah, I know.
Show up to a Shinto temple in North America, they probably won't. So
Absolutely.
I just want to clarify that was Eastern Western religion, which we've already talked about as a garbage title, not Eastern Western global.
Yeah. I mean, even world religions is a weird made-up title. We have to classify things somehow if we're going to start studying them, and the way we did it with religions is just a little bit weird.
We should rename our podcast the Classification Podcast, because basically we spent 5 episodes being like, all these definitions are garbage, but we don't have anything better.
You're wrong, but I'm not going to tell you what's right.
Because there's nothing more right than this wrong one. So I hope you guys are learning stuff.
At the very least, we hope to entertain and give you something to talk about with your friends and family that normally you wouldn't talk about because you didn't have the right words.
Right. And this episode, if I'm not mistaken, will be released early December. So hopefully you'll have some cool stuff to talk about at Christmas with your family. Yeah. Because there's Or at
Come up with a
any,
reason to throw mashed potatoes at your brother.
right? Or at any holiday you may be celebrating in December. Spoiler for next episode.
There's loads of different ways to look at the gods and religions around the world. Dividing them east and west is not super helpful, in my opinion, but defining things by the way they model their theologies, I think, is far more constructive.
Monotheistic, polytheistic would be a better
Yeah,
way to
and
divide religion.
maybe a little bit of henotheism halfway through that spectrum.
Let's push that henotheism, guys. That's all for this episode, guys.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you one more time before 2021 and 2020 can fuck off.
Right. What a terrible year.
I mean, we started a podcast, so that's pretty good. And you're
Right?
all listening to your new favorite podcast. So there's a bright, shining star in 2020.
Absolutely.
All right. Until next time, guys.
Christian
Peace be with you.
God is real.